My name is Sadie Klonel, and I live in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I own Knox Survival Paint Company. I am here to show you all the things that you may need when you're getting ready to do a professional paint project as a professional or unprofessional. One of the tips that I give homeowners is to dream of the space that we're getting ready to paint and think to themselves, what do I want to feel like in this space? Now that I know what that feeling is, what color makes me feel that feeling? People will go pick colors based on trends, but really what people need to do is pick colors based on how it makes them feel, not how it makes other people feel, because you're the one living with it. Picking a color for a house can be very daunting. I would walk in and be like, I like this color, this color, this color, this color, and then you think, I'm gonna find a space for all of these things in my house. Sometimes though, when people get in and they've got 4, 5, 6 colors in their house, you don't feel like you're connected to your space. If you're walking from one room to the next room and there's a completely clashing color, you're gonna feel the change of the room. You're gonna go from this serene space of, whatever color makes you feel that way to change the color, and then all of a sudden, you might feel like amped up or energized. I get all of the colors that I want to use on a board. And then from there, I say, okay, all of these colors together, which one of these colors look the best together? And pick a color that goes with all the other colors. A very good practice is to have all of your walls in a house that are connecting rooms be either the same color or a different strength of the same color. That way they feel connected. I think that any space that feels completely separate is a fun place to do different paints, different wallpapers to tie those kind of things in. Take a sample of whatever color it is that you're using and take it into every space that it's going to be. So not just do a swatch on a wall in the living room if you're also planning on doing the kitchen the same color. Put it in both spaces, that way you can see the lighting in the kitchen, you can see the lighting in the living room, you can see the lighting wherever it is, because you may have the same white and in both of those spaces it could look completely different. What happens is there'll be a color that's everywhere. You'll have a color of the year from all the different paint companies and it looks beautiful everywhere and you think, oh my gosh, I want to put that in my living room. And part of what is not factored in is that color is still going to be in your living room in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years. I think that you have to factor in if you're a person who regularly changes your furniture, if you're somebody who's going to keep that furniture for the next 5, 10, 15 years, you want to make sure that the color you pick is something that's going to be timeless, not something that's going to be changing with the trends and it's going to be 6 months later and you're feeling frustrated that it's too much color or not enough color. Most of the time with most companies, paint samples come in eggshell. They come in eggshell and it's usually not the lowest grade of that company's paint, but it's more of a mid-grade paint. So anytime you go higher in quality of paint, there usually is going to be more sheen. And the more sheen there is, the more washability there is. This right here is a sample paint. It is very, it's dry, if I rub it too much, we're gonna have fingerprints. So it's an eggshell, but it is a lower grade eggshell. I could wash it, but it's just not to the extent where if I have super muddy hands, or in my case, painty hands, and I rub my hand on it, that I'm gonna be able to clean it. Versus if I go into the same color that is in a higher quality eggshell, it's smooth. It is something, and they're the same application that I put on them, but it's smooth. It's something that if I were to wipe other paint on it, once it's cured, I could just get soap and water and wipe it off. And this is in a scuff resistant paint. So it actually has a tiny bit more sheen, even though they're the same color and the same finish. The #1 washable paint is gonna be semi-gloss. I think that a lot of people like trim to be semi-gloss because it is super, super cleanable. Luckily, there have been changes to paint over the years that make it so that a satin is about as washable as a semi-gloss. The difference is that the semi-gloss, it is super durable, but it is super difficult to touch up, versus a satin, which I think is the absolute best paint for trim, where you still have some of the sheen, it's super, super washable, but when you touch it up, even if there is a little bit of a difference, you're not able to see it because the light doesn't reflect so highly off of it. When you go down to something like eggshell, it is still super washable, but once again, the reflective value is a lot less, which a lot of people like this on the walls because you want your trim to stand out. Staying with the same color in a different sheen for the trim is amazing. So if you were to go something like this that's a satin, and then you have the same color in something that's a matte, then you have the same color feeling, but the contrast is different. You've got a little bit more washability on your trim, you've got a little bit easier touch up on your walls, and you still feel like you've done something different and there's something fun within the space. Bathrooms hold water. That's just factual. You got steam all over the place and it's sitting on your walls. You want paint in your bathroom to be super, super cured. Basically what it's saying is that you want a little bit more of like an enamel in your bathroom paint so that steam sits on top of the paint rather than penetrates into the paint. When you have a flat paint, it's still leaving the surface a little bit porous, versus if you have something that's a super high sheen, nothing's getting through here. If you've got something that's more of a flat, I could probably soak something on here and eventually it would be able to soak into this board. So that's why a lot of times I say, regardless of what everything in the house is, in the bathroom, I would do a higher sheen. A satin paint or a specific bathroom paint is always gonna be better because it is more mold resistant and it's much more cleanable. We use a lot of different brushes as painters. A lot of oil-based paints, you're gonna use a boar bristle brush or something that's a natural bristle brush because it's easier to work with oil-based. But there are a lot of different companies that make a Nylox or a nylon bristle, which they're usually kind of orange in color and they're easy to clean with oil-based paints also, versus when you get something like this, which is a thinner bristle, usually this is for latex. Prepare yourself to have quite a bit of paint thinner if you're using an oil-based brush. Once it's cleaned, we'll take it and we'll put it back in the brush cover, and because it holds the form of the brush a lot better, and you actually don't really have to let it dry. We usually take the brush and then we put it back in the cover, seal it up, and then when you store it, just store it like this. These brushes that are 3-inch and flat brushes are really great for exterior paint. It holds more paint and it's easier in siding and things like that to keep a straight edge, versus a brush that is thinner and smaller holds less paint and it's easier for things that are detail oriented where you don't want to be as messy. Let's talk about naps. Beyond brushes, naps are going to be the second most useful thing that you use. They come in pretty much 3 sizes. You've got a 4-inch nap, you've got an 18-inch nap, and then you've got a 9-inch nap. I would say that the most used would be the 9-inch just because it seems to be the typical one that people go towards. As professional painters, we tend to use an 18-inch or a 4-inch more than we ever use a 9-inch nap, because most of the time if you're painting a large space, an 18-inch nap takes up the whole area, so you're only going to have to go through 2 or 3 different passes, versus if you use a 9-inch, you're looking at 5 or 6 to take up a space, like a 12-inch ceiling. If you're using thick paint, you want to use something that is a thicker nap. So for instance, this is a 1/2-inch nap. It's spreading the thicker paint more easily, versus if you have something like this, which is a 3/4-inch nap, it is going to have a smoother finish for paint that is not as thick. So if you're ever rolling a clear coat or something with a higher sheen, you want to use something that is a 3/4 nap. There are a lot of different nap options. The safest thing for you to go with is a 3/8 nap. If you're gonna have a heavier paint or you wanna only do 1 coat, which I don't usually recommend, you wanna use something like a 1/2-inch nap because it's gonna hold more paint and put a thicker coat. I like microfiber naps because I think that they are easy to clean. I think that they always put a smooth finish and you don't really have to worry about there being as much of that texture left on the wall, even when you're using an eggshell paint. A nap like this I really like because it's loose and it holds the paint, but it also releases the paint well. This is a paint grid. So you're gonna take your roller grid and you're gonna just place it in your bucket. I recommend putting it in before you put the paint in the bucket, so you're not gonna wanna put it in the same bucket as the paint that you're using. You'll wanna get an empty bucket. I usually just take an old bucket, take the wrapping off of it, clean it out, and then you're good to go. You'll place the grid into the bucket and it just sits inside underneath the little ledge. And then you're gonna take your mini roller after you've poured the paint in. I never would go above half of the gallon of paint because then you're gonna start getting into getting all the paint down here and on your hand, and that's very frustrating. So when you're done, you can leave it in there by resting it on this little ledge. There's a little notch that sits so that you're not dunking it into the paint. You'll basically just take the paint and you'll roll it in on the grid, and it pushes the paint off of the roller nap back into there. And then it's really nice because you can just take your grid out, put the lid back on, and then you have a place to store it. You walk into the sandpaper aisle and there are so many different grits of sandpaper. You go from 60 grit, which is super, super rough, to 400, 600, 800 grit, which are super, super smooth. A rule of thumb that I have is you pretty much always have 180 and 220 on you, just period. Anytime there's a wood surface that you're preparing, you're gonna need 180 and 220. When you get into things like clear coats and fine finishes or high glosses, anything that's not just a latex paint on trim, you're gonna wanna get into something that's a little bit higher, like a 320, which is what I would use when I'm finishing a door for sanding in between clear coats. And sometimes I would even go up to a 400. But just for everyday sanding trim, getting ready to paint, I would use 180 or 220. So one thing you also want to remember is if you do need to use a super heavy grit sandpaper, you're always going to want to go back with a higher grit sandpaper to smooth it out. A lot of what I do is I get a full piece of sandpaper and then I'll fold the sandpaper into squares, because it's easier to get into the fine areas, and then you can get into places that are harder to like sand with a sanding block. I'll refold it, I'll fold it around, I'll do all these different things so that I can utilize the most out of the sandpaper and not waste it. Painter's tape is the #1 thing that we use in the industry. I spend more money on this than anything else. We use it for everything. We use it to mask, we use it on rollers to clean them, we use it on brushes to keep the paint from dripping down. There are a lot of different types of tape, but what you really want to pay attention to is if it says it's for walls, if it says it's for masonry. If specifically on stone and plaster and brick, we use masonry tape, which is a little bit more tacky so it sticks to those surfaces. Another item is a hand masker. So you can keep pulling it, it'll keep taking the tape out, and then as soon as you go and you're done and you have the piece that you need, you'll take this, you'll rip it, and then you're ready to put it on whatever surface that you need to do it. You can use tape and you can wrap the tape around the nap, and then after you wrap it, you're just gonna take the tape and peel it off again, and it'll make it so that if there's any loose fuzz or any dust or anything like that, it'll come off on the tape. It'll make it so that there's no dust, no fuzz left. I hope that everything I've talked about is super helpful. The key points are you can help keep your space clean. It makes it easier for yourself. Using high quality materials actually makes a difference. It's gonna be able to last for a longer time and you're gonna enjoy it much better. A lot of people like to keep their original doors. Whoever painted this previously had a lot of brush strokes in it, and if you don't sand down the brush strokes, when you paint it again, you're gonna see their brush strokes. We tend to leave hinges on in general because it keeps the integrity of the wood, but especially when the door is older, I don't like to take the hinges or the knobs off. So as much as I can, I try to keep everything intact and just mask it off. I always recommend doing 2 coats of paint pretty much on anything, but especially doors. #1, because they get beat up a lot, but also because you want it to be stronger and it just keeps the integrity of the door. A lot of old doors have been painted with oil-based paint, and then a lot of times people will come back with latex or water-based paint on top of it. You can usually just do a test by taking it and trying to scratch it. If it scratches off super easy with a fingernail, it's probably oil-based paint, and then you would need to prime the whole thing. But as long as it's not oil-based paint, I usually just take a piece of sandpaper, I fold it with my hand, and then I go with 150 grit, then 220 grit, make sure that everything is smoothed out and that all of those brush strokes are smoothed out. As you can see up here, I went ahead and already primed with an oil-based primer. I always recommend using oil or shellac, something in it that's gonna keep the tannins in and keep the paint to stick, especially if there was stain or something oil-based. You always wanna prime anything that was oil with oil. You can always put latex paint on top of oil-based primer. You cannot put latex paint on top of oil-based paint. It will not adhere. One tip to not waste brushes is if you have an old brush, soak it in soap and water and use it as a dust brush, because once it softens out, it's actually better to have it feathered because it's a lot easier to just sweep it. Think of it like a little broom. You can just get a little bit of thinner and put it on a rag, just like a little bit of it, and just wipe it on the door. It will take any of the little bits of residue and just kind of loosen them up, as you can see, and just get some of the dirt and clean it off. Any kind of those wipes that have some like cleaning chemical on it is fine. When the door is 20, 30 years old, we end up having to strip the whole door. The biggest reason is because of flaking paint. If you see a door that has a ton of crack lines in it, could be a sign that there's lead in it. 20, 30 years old, you always want to test your doors. If I think there's lead, I will not scrape it. I'll go ahead and test it, put respirator, that kind of thing, or honestly get somebody who does lead remediation. If there's no lead and I can tell that it was just an oil-based paint, that's usually why we would strip it, because somebody has put a latex paint on top of an oil paint. When you scratch it, it just comes off. There's nothing to stick to. The next step is to actually start to paint. You're gonna want a mini roller, which is what I do a majority of the door with, and then you'll still want a brush to be able to cut in all of the corners and any of the sides. A lot of people will get a rolling tray. I don't use a rolling tray. We just put a grid in the bucket, and as long as you've got a 4-inch mini roller, it will fit in the bucket, so you can still roll with the grid to get the excess paint off of the roller. You'll still want to use a separate paint bucket than what you get the paint in, so it's not full. But once you're done with this, if you don't want to pour it back into the other can, you can just stick a lid on it and you're good to go. We will tape the brush off so that when you're having the brush like this, it's not leaking down all over your hand. When you go to cut in on a door, you'll put heavy paint just to start, but then as you're getting more paint off your brush, you don't want to dip it more. You start heavy and then you let it get thinner as you go. And then as you're getting less paint on your brush, and you'll see it become a little bit more transparent, you want to go back to the first place that you started and just start feathering it out even more in the cut line. We go ahead and we cut in all of the edges on the door and then we roll it afterwards. It's a lot easier to roll the flat areas and then you don't have brush marks all over the door. You're gonna take your roller and just go all the way up to that edge and roll over the cut line so that your brush marks go away. Anything you're painting, the number one thing that matters is prep work. What is underneath your painted surface controls how well your painted surface looks. What we would do is we would go in, we would say, I'm looking at this room, let's find every imperfection. The next thing would be to caulk and fill all of the nail holes. You try to fill a hole, there's a little bit of a nail sticking out and it doesn't look right, it starts coming out, you don't really know what to do. So you want all of the nails to be as deeply in as they can without messing up the trim work. There are nail sets that you get that have a spring and you just smack the nail in, super easy, pushes the nail in further and gives you room to actually fill the hole. Use as many long caulk lines as you can to keep it even, rather than stopping and starting and stopping and starting and stopping and starting. When you're painting new drywall, rather than just repainting a room, you'll start by priming the walls to even out where there's lumps or holes that need to be filled. Rule of thumb, before you actually start painting, the best thing that you can do is sand all of the spaces quickly. You'll take something like a 220 grit, or if you have a sanding block that's like medium or light grit, you just go over everything again. Then you're gonna wipe the walls down with something microfiber or vacuum them, depending on how you wanna do it. Get all the dust out of the room, because if you have dust left, you'll get these bumpy areas in the paint that you don't want. Cleaning and getting the surface fully prepared makes a huge difference. A lot of people know that you start with the ceiling, but they don't really understand why. So you finish your ceiling, and then you never have to touch your ceiling again. When you're cutting in on the ceiling, which is honestly probably the hardest place to cut in, if you get some on the wall, it's not a big deal because you can either lightly sand it, or if it's thin enough, just go ahead and paint over it with wall paint. Usually when you're cutting in, you want to use an angle brush because it's easier to get the paint evenly in there. A lot of people think, get a lot of paint on the brush, just smear it in there. You actually are going to have a much cleaner cut line the less paint that you use. If you're going next to a door frame, sometimes it can actually be helpful to have a flat edge. This little tip at the end, when you go to turn a corner, sometimes can leave paint pooled in the corners. And so if you're using a flat brush, when you go to the corner, it stops, and then you can just turn it and it's not pushing up into the corner and leaving the same kind of bunched in the edge. But it's also a preference thing, and you'll get used to what's comfortable. I prefer smaller brushes because my hands are smaller, but even some of my painters who have small hands prefer a bigger brush because it's weighted and it helps them keep the paint evenly. Behind that, I would come in with a mini roller, use this after we cut in to smooth out the lines so that it's a little bit more seamless and you're not seeing the same brush marks. So then after you cut in, we would then take the 9-inch or the 18-inch roller, whichever you prefer, put it on a rolling pole. My rule of thumb is basically like if it's a 10-foot ceiling, you just want to be able to reach the ceiling comfortably without having your arms completely extended because you will be very uncomfortable the next day. Get your roller bucket ready, get your naps ready. Most of the time we will use a 3/4 inch nap. I prefer the 18-inch nap rather than a 9 or even a 14. As long as your room is big enough, it covers more space and you can get it done a little bit quicker. Take the roller frame and basically you just roll out the ceiling. After you finish your ceiling, it'll be time to move on to trim. You'll use a brush to frame around and get as close as you can to the edge as possible. If you go a little over, it's okay because we'll come back with the wall paint and cover any mistakes. I'd recommend doing 3 coats of paint for the trim, 2 thinner ones and 1 thicker one with sanding in between. Just make sure to brush away any drips or big globs of paint. Once your trim is dry, you'll use painter's tape and masking paper to protect from any drips. Then we'll follow the same steps that we used on the ceilings. You'll start with a medium brush to cut in around the doors in the trim. You can use an angle brush or a flat brush, whatever your preference is. I tend to use an angle brush because it's able to smooth out the corners a little bit better. After you brush it out, you'll want to use a mini roller to blend the cut lines into the wall and use the same 18-inch roller to come and roll all of the walls. You'll want to let it dry 2 to 4 hours, then repeat with additional coats until you have full coverage. We usually do 2 coats, but if there's a drastic color change like light to dark or dark to really light, you'll probably want to have a 3rd coat.